He didn't come to the dance with a record. He came with a wall. The summer of 1949, in the yards and open lots of Kingston's West End, a man named V. Edwards arrived at a lawn dance on Orange Street, dragging something nobody on the block had ever heard before. A speaker cabinet, so tall it nearly scraped the corrugated zinc roof of the yard next door. Powered by an amplifier he had built himself from salvaged radio components, wired through a needle cartridge balanced on the lip of a spinning American shellac disc. Before the first record dropped, the people standing nearest to the cabinet stepped back, not because they were afraid, because they felt it in their chest before they heard it with their ears. That was King Edwards. That was the beginning. To understand what King Edwards meant to Jamaican music, you have to understand what Kingston looked like in the years immediately after World War II, a colonial city under British administration, deeply stratified by class and color, with a working-class black majority that had precious little entertainment, precious little economic hope, and an appetite for music so powerful it bordered on something spiritual. There were no Jamaican recording studios yet. There was no Jamaican popular music industry. There was radio, the Jamaica Broadcasting Corporation, which played mostly British programming, classical music, and the occasional concession to Caribbean folk forms. And there were the dances, not clubs, not venues with stages and bouncers and cover charges. Dances, held in yards, in open lots, on the lawns outside houses in Maxfield Park and Denham Town and Trench Town and Bacco Wall. These were community events as much as they were parties, and the men who ran them, who sourced the records, built the equipment, and controlled the crowd, held a kind of authority that was social, economic, and in some ways almost political. By 1949, 3 names had risen to define the Kingston sound system scene, and those 3 names would be spoken together for decades, the way you might name the 3 original forces of nature. There was Tom Wong, known as Tom the Great Sebastian, the Chinese-Jamaican entrepreneur from West Kingston who had built his system first and biggest, whose lawn dances at Bournemouth Beach and Jubilee Tile Gardens drew the largest crowds in the city. There was Clement Dodd, years from his Studio One destiny, building his own reputation in the early days. And there was Duke Reid, the policeman-turned-liquor store owner, turned sound system king, who had married into resources and used them to build a system of ferocious power and aristocratic menace. These names dominate the histories. But there is a name that belongs alongside them, that the written record has been slower to claim, a man who ran the 3rd great original system in Kingston, who competed directly with the Great Sebastian in the years before Duke Reid's dominance was absolute, who trained his ears on American rhythm and blues with the same obsessive precision as the men who would become legends. That name was King Edwards. His full name was V. Edwards. The sources from that era rarely give the first name in full, a gap that itself speaks to the problem of researching the early sound system era in Jamaica. The written record is thin, colonial biased, and largely filtered through the lens of what became commercially successful later. King Edwards did not own a liquor store. He did not end up building a recording studio. He did not produce records that entered the international market. He was a sound system man, purely and completely. And in Jamaica in 1949, that was enough to make him one of the most powerful figures in the cultural life of Kingston's working class. What distinguished King Edwards from the beginning was his relationship with American music. The sound system operators of the era were all, at their core, record collectors and importers. They sourced their music from New York, from Miami, from labels like Atlantic, King, Savoy, labels that were pressing the rhythm and blues records that the black American market was consuming at an extraordinary rate in the post-war period. Every sound man who traveled to the United States came back with crates of shellac, and the quality of your selection, the freshness of the tunes, the depth of the soul in the grooves, was the measure of your reputation as much as the size of your speakers. King Edwards had a gift for selection that his contemporaries acknowledged. His ability to identify the record that would move the crowd, not the record that was obviously big, but the one that would hit in a Kingston yard in a way it had never been designed to hit, became one of the defining features of his reputation. He was pulling records from the deep American South, from small pressing operations that most of his rivals had never heard of, and when those records played out of his speaker towers in the yards of West Kingston, they sounded like they had always belonged there. There was something in the way Edwards read a crowd, an instinctive intelligence about the emotional temperature of a dance, that the people who danced at his events still talked about years later. His speaker system was a technological act of ambition. The early Kingston sound systems were not sophisticated by the standards of what would come later. They were built from whatever could be sourced, assembled, and powered in a city without reliable electricity, and without access to the industrial materials that American sound companies took for granted. King Edwards built his cabinets from local wood. The accounts suggest he worked with a carpenter in his neighborhood who understood acoustics in the intuitive, practical way that craftsmen acquire through repetition, and the bass response of those cabinets, in the open air of a Kingston yard, became part of his legend. People didn't just say the music was good. They said you felt King Edwards before you heard him. This matters because the sound system wars of 1940s and 50s Kingston were not merely cultural events. They were economic competitions with real stakes. The gate receipts from a successful lawn dance, the reputation that brought more dancers the following week, the hierarchy of which operator commanded which territory and which audience. Tom the Great Sebastian held the largest claim in the early years. But Kingston was a city of neighborhoods, of fiercely local loyalties, and there was space, and indeed necessity, for multiple competing systems. King Edwards operated in the same West Kingston territory as Sebastian, and the competition between them was the defining rivalry of the earliest era before Duke Reid's money and Coxswain A. Dodd's strategic genius transformed the landscape. The dances they ran were not simply entertainment. They were the nervous system of the community. Kingston in the late 1940s was a city managing the social upheaval of returning soldiers, of rural migration that had overwhelmed the urban infrastructure, of a working-class population that colonial education and colonial economics had systematically excluded from mainstream economic participation. The sound system dance was one of the few spaces where that exclusion did not apply, where the man who worked the docks all week could be, on Saturday night, part of something extraordinary, something that belonged to him and his neighbors, and no one else. King Edwards understood this. The way he ran his dances, the attention to the crowd's mood, the way he paced the music through the night, the instinct for when to lift and when to let the tension build, reflected an understanding of what these events meant to the people attending them. There is a detail about King Edwards that surfaces in the oral histories collected by researchers who went back to the original Kingston sound system generation in the 1980s and 90s, long after those men and women had aged into memory keepers. It is a small detail, almost throwaway, but it has never been fully explained. Edwards was known, at the height of his reputation, for playing one record at every dance that he never identified. Not the artist, not the label, not the title. He would set it down on the turntable without announcement, let it play, and when the crowd was fully in it, when the dance had reached that particular temperature that the old people described as something close to communion, he would lift the needle before the record ended. The version that was passed down in memory said he never played the full record, not once, and nobody ever found out what it was. The rivalry between King Edwards and Tom the Great Sebastian operated on terms that were deeply personal, as well as commercial. Both men were competing for the same West Kingston audience, and both had legitimate claims to dominance in that territory. The dances they ran would sometimes be held on the same night in different yards, and the question of which crowd was larger, which system played louder, which selector read the room better, was debated by the people who attended with the same intensity that sporting rivalries were debated. Tom the Great Sebastian had the institutional advantage. He had been established longer, his name was more widely known, his operation was better resourced. But King Edwards had something that is harder to document, and harder to dismiss. A following that was intensely loyal, that came back not just because the music was good, but because something specific to his dances kept pulling them. Duke Reid's entrance into the upper tier of the Kingston sound system world shifted the balance in ways that neither Sebastian nor Edwards had fully anticipated. Reid had resources that came from a different source: his wife's liquor store, his connections to a certain kind of Kingston enforcer culture, and a willingness to spend on speakers and records that reflected the confidence of a man who had once carried a badge and understood what physical authority meant in the streets. By the early 1950s, the configuration that historians would later call the Holy Trinity, Sebastian, Duke Reid, and King Edwards, was established, and the competition between them shaped the DNA of what Jamaican popular music would become. The selector culture that emerged from this competition, the art of cueing records, reading the crowd, controlling the dance's emotional temperature across the arc of a night, is the direct ancestor of every DJ and producer and sound engineer who would follow. When Coxsone Dodd began his own rise, when Lee Scratch Perry first encountered a studio, when King Tubby built his sound in Waterhouse in the 1960s, all of these men were inheriting a practice that Tom Wong, Duke Reid, and King Edwards had developed in the open air of Kingston's West End yards. The studio would come later. The music that would eventually travel the world was still years away. But the architecture, the idea that a single person with the right records and the right equipment could transform the emotional reality of a neighborhood for 4 hours on a Saturday night, that was already fully formed in the dances that King Edwards ran. What happened to King Edwards in the mid-1950s is where the historical record becomes frustratingly incomplete. By 1956, his name appears with diminishing frequency in the accounts of the Kingston dance scene. The trajectory of the era's other major figures is documentable in some form. Duke Reid would go on to found Treasure Isle Records, to produce Rocksteady's defining catalog, to become one of the most important producers in Jamaican music history. Coxsone Dodd would build Studio One. Tom, the Great Sebastian, would step back from active operation and see his legacy absorbed into the origin mythology of the entire sound system tradition. But King Edwards disappears from the documentation in a way that raises questions nobody has fully answered. The accounts that exist offer different versions. Some of the oral history collected by researchers suggests that Edwards made a deliberate decision to pull back from the increasingly intense competition, that as Duke Reid's resources and Reid's particular brand of intimidation began to reshape the power dynamics of the scene, Edwards chose not to escalate in the same way. Others suggest that the emergence of the recording studio fundamentally changed what a sound system man could accomplish, and that Edwards, whose identity was wholly bound to the live dance experience, did not make the transition. There is a third account passed down more obliquely that involves a falling out with one of the other major operators, a dispute whose details were never made public and whose consequences were understood to be final. What is not disputed is that by the time Jamaican music entered its next transformative phase, the ska era of the early 1960s, driven by the Studio One sound and the Treasure Isle catalog, King Edwards was not a participant in the same way he had been. His name survived in the memories of the people who had danced at his events. It survived in the acknowledgments that Duke Reid and Coxsone Dodd sometimes offered when pressed by interviewers about who had come before. It survived in the oral traditions of the Kingston West End neighborhoods where those early dances had taken place. The importance of King Edwards to the larger history of Jamaican music operates on two levels. The first is the direct level. His participation in the founding era, his contribution to the competitive culture that refined the sound system, art form, his influence on the selection practices that would define how Jamaican popular music was curated and presented to its original audience. The second level is more systemic. King Edwards is an argument for why the history of the early Kingston sound system scene cannot be fully understood by focusing only on the figures who made the transition to the recording industry. The sound system era was not simply a prelude to the studio era. It was a fully formed cultural institution in its own right, And the men who built that institution were not only the ones who parlayed it into commercial recording empires. Tom the Great Sebastian is in the story because he was there first, and because the documentation of his role has been preserved in part through the testimony of the musicians and producers who followed him. Duke Reid is in the story because Treasure Isle Records and its rock-steady catalog are tangible, undeniable, internationally distributed evidence of his creative and commercial intelligence. But King Edwards is in the story not because of what came after him, but because of what he was in the moment. One of the three original architects of a cultural form that would, across the next 4 decades, travel from Kingston yards to international stages, from lawn dances to world music charts, from a city that colonial administration had treated as peripheral to a global cultural force that nobody had predicted. The Jamaican sound system was the first form of DJ culture in the world. This is not a minor claim. The practice of playing recorded music for a dancing audience, reading that audience, building an emotional arc across a night, competing with rival operators for the loyalty of a community. This practice, developed in Kingston's yards in the late 1940s, predates American DJ culture, predates the European club scene, predates every form of music delivery technology that would eventually define the late 20th century's relationship to popular music. And King Edwards was one of the 3 men who built it. The scholars who have worked hardest to recover the full picture of the early Kingston sound system era: Lloyd Bradley, in his landmark history Bass Culture, Norman Stolzoff in Wake the Town and Tell the People, the sociologists and ethnomusicologists who spent years conducting oral interviews with the men and women who were present, all grapple with the problem of King Edwards in roughly the same way. He is consistently named as a foundational figure. He is consistently placed alongside Tom Wong and Duke Reid in the foundational account, and he consistently defies the kind of detailed documentation that the other figures eventually accumulate. This is not an accident. It is a feature of a historical record, shaped by what got written down, what got recorded, what got preserved through institutional channels that were themselves shaped by the colonial and commercial priorities of the era. The records that King Edwards played have not been identified. The addresses of the yards where his dances were held have not been systematically documented. The names of the carpenters who built his speaker cabinets, the engineers who helped him wire his amplifiers, the selectors who worked alongside him, these names are largely lost. What survives is the testimony of memory, passed from the people who danced at his events to their children and to the researchers who eventually came looking, and that testimony is consistent on the things that matter. King Edwards was there. King Edwards was real. King Edwards was one of the 3. There is something worth sitting with in the question of what it means to be foundational without being famous. The historiography of popular music has always tended toward the figures who produced tangible artifacts, records, albums, studio sessions, because those artifacts provide the evidentiary foundation that academic and journalistic documentation requires. The men and women who did the cultural work that made those artifacts possible, who built the scenes, who trained the audiences, who created the competitive environment in which the recording industry would eventually emerge, are systematically underrepresented in the written record. King Edwards is one of those figures. His legacy is not located in a record catalog or a studio address or a label imprint. It is located in the form itself, in the very idea that a man with speakers and records and an understanding of what a Kingston crowd needed could shape the cultural life of a neighborhood and through that contribute to the shaping of an entire global musical tradition. Every selector who has ever read a room, every DJ who has ever known which record to drop next, every producer who has ever understood that music is not only what you play, but when you play it and how you let it breathe, all of them are working in a tradition that King Edwards helped build. The mystery of the record he never finished playing, the one track that he would drop the needle on and pull before the crowd ever heard the end, was never solved. The old-timers who remembered it from those Kingston yard dances disagreed on everything except the fact of it. Some said it was a slow American blues record. Some said it was something else entirely, something without a label or a clear pressing date. Some said it was not a single record at all, but a different record each time, that what appeared to be the same unfinished song was actually a different one every night, and that Edwards was making a point so subtle only the most attentive dancers ever caught it. What the point was, nobody could say with certainty. But the ones who tried to articulate it said something like this: the record that never ended was a reminder that the dance was never really over, that the music Kingston was making in those yards, in those nights, in that particular convergence of community and sound and American rhythm filtered through Jamaican experience, was something still in process, something that had not yet become what it was going to become, something that required patience and return, and the willingness to show up the next Saturday night, and the one after that. King Edwards left the active sound system scene before Jamaican music found its international voice. He was not in the room when Bob Marley walked into Studio One. He was not behind the board when the rock-steady rhythms that would define Treasure Isle were laid down. He was not a participant in the commercial recording era that took Jamaica's music to the world. He was a sound system man, purely, and he operated in the era when that was the whole thing, before the studios, before the labels, before the global audience. But the studios came from the sound systems. The labels grew from the competitive culture the sound system operators had built. The global audience was shaped by the musical intelligence, the selectorship, the crowd reading, the instinct for what a Jamaican working-class community needed to hear, and when that King Edwards and his two rivals had developed in the open yards of Kingston's West End across more than a decade of Saturday nights. The third giant of the original sound system, Trinity, has been waiting a long time for the full accounting of what he was and what he built. The record is incomplete, the documentation is thin, the name has traveled mostly through memory and oral tradition, and the quiet acknowledgments of the men who came after. But the acknowledgments are there, they are consistent, and they are enough to establish the historical truth that the culture that would eventually become one of the most influential musical traditions on earth was not built by two men. It was built by three. Was King Edward's retreat from the sound system scene a defeat, or was it finally a refusal to let the thing he built become something he no longer recognized? That is the question the incomplete record leaves open, and the answer depends entirely on what you believe the first era of Kingston sound culture was really about.